I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, and welcome to episode number 10 of Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am your gracious host, Dr. Tasia White, and it feels so good to be back. So if you listened to episode number 9.5, because I didn't want to call it a full episode, but episode 9.5, I sort of shared that there were some personal things that I was dealing with that were preventing me from continuing with this podcast. So, full disclosure, there was a lot happening. First and foremost, I think I mentioned this in episode 9.5. I was launching a new coaching program during the month of April called 22 Happier You. And it was something brand new that I had never done before and had done a lot of research. And it turned out to be really, really great. I enjoyed how it all turned out, but that took a lot of my time. And so as a result, I didn't get a chance to record episode number 10 of this podcast. And then something else that came up was I lost my uncle, and it was something that really impacted me more than I had ever anticipated because, for one, it was not expected. He was fairly young, and I say fairly young. He was, in his early 50s, which I feel is fairly young. And he also had this sort of youthful spirit, and so that's what sort of adds to how I felt like he was young. But if you knew him, you would know that it was just way too soon for him. And my uncle and I sort of had this unique dynamic because we were only about 16 years apart. And for some people, that's the difference between them and a sibling. And so one of the things that I vividly remember is a conversation we had back in December where he said, we practically grew up together. And that was something I'd never really considered until he said it. And it wasn't until his passing that I really began to appreciate what he was saying in that statement. And so this was a very significant loss for me and my family. And so as you can imagine, needing to take some time to mourn, to regroup, to sort of get back into some sort of normalcy after going back home and spending a significant amount of time with family, partially for his funeral, but also there were some other trips I already had planned in the month of May. And so everything just sort of seemed to happen around the same time. I really wasn't home much in the month of May. And so that made it a little bit challenging to do some work, as you can imagine. So again, I am happy to be back. Now, I'm sure some people may be wondering, well, then why not just end the season where it was? Well, I had considered that briefly, but then I was reminded of the plan that I had for this first season, which is essentially to lay the foundation for how I view leadership and use this to establish a basis of understanding. And then the next season is going to be totally different because once we got to season 2, we would continue to talk about the topics from season 1 with various guests, sharing their insights and their expertise on leadership and having it be more of an engaging conversation. And I wanted to make sure you all were prepared for that. And so that is what I wanted to do with this season. All right, so with that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's topic. So today's topic is how to make your employees shine. I will admit that this topic is something that has intrigued me ever since I learned about it in graduate school. And since learning about this topic, I have found creative ways to present this topic to my various teams. I also referenced this topic in my dissertation. And once you get a sense for what it is, you'll understand why I'm so passionate about it. And I will be particularly focusing on the performance appraisal process and how that plays into making your employees shine, although that's not necessarily the approach that the author of the book focused on. So I learned about this concept from Edward Hallowell, MD, in his book, Shine, Using Brain Science to Get the Best from Your People. And it's probably one of my favorite books from graduate school, next to the Harvard Business Review Top 10 Reads, which I've referenced basically in every episode. And what I appreciate most about this book is that he really dives into the science of the brain. And I'm a little bit nerdy in that I am interested in understanding the brain and have read other books related to how the brain works. And this was probably the first one that really got me into the topic of brain science or neuroscience. And so I really enjoyed learning how all of the concepts that he identified is connected to how one moves in their work environment. And so upon learning about this topic, I became much more aware of the things that I was saying and doing to make sure that my actions were triggering the right behaviors of my staff members. Now, this might sound a little familiar, right? Because if you go back to episode number 3, where we talked about transactional versus transformative leadership, I talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how we have to be conscientious of how we treat our employees and what we do to try to motivate them, because having that awareness leads to better retention and more productivity. And although Hallowell does touch on that in a slightly different way, my main focus is understanding the 5 steps that Hallowell has identified to make our employees shine, and how we can incorporate this concept in our performance appraisal practices. So in this book, which I will include a link to on my website, but in this book, Hallowell talks about how he used brain science to develop a formula for peak performance. And in his book, he says that in order to obtain peak performance, each person has to be in the right place, the right job, the right conditions, and the right fit. And we sort of touched on this a little bit in episodes 7 and 8, where I talked about establishing a cohesive team dynamic. So this should not seem unfamiliar. But one of the things that Hallowell highlights is that we as managers or leaders need to bring out the best in the people that we're supervising. In order to do so, we have to get them in the right frame of mind to shine. And shine is essentially equivalent to what Maslow called self-actualization. So if you remember when we talked about that in episode number 3, self-actualization is the top of the pyramid. And so once we're able to address things like security and physical space and sense of belonging and having that sense of importance, and then getting to that top tier of self-actualization, that's when our employees can shine. That's where they shine, because they understand how they contribute to the greater whole. Now let's unpack that a little bit more. So when Hallowell talked about conditions, he identified 3 specific conditions. The first one being the way in which we communicate with our employees or team members. And I feel like I touched on this a little bit in episode number 4, where I talked about emotional intelligence, making sure that we are modeling the behavior that we want to see in our employees. And so if we are communicating with them in a way that is going to make them fearful of us, then obviously that's not a good environment, right? So something we need to consider as a work condition. The second one is the tasks that we ask our employees to perform, making sure that the tasks that we are asking of them is something that they can actually do. Now, obviously, when we hire people, we hire them with the understanding that they are able to do what is on the job description, right? However, things change, positions change, certain skill sets may be required because of some changes within the company. And so when that happens, we have to make sure that whomever we are giving those tasks to are able to perform them, but also making sure that they feel confident performing those tasks. And this makes me think about my own situation that I've shared previously, where I was put in a role that I didn't necessarily feel confident in because I didn't understand that area. I didn't understand HIPAA. I didn't understand all of these different components that were so crucial for my team. And having to learn that while also learn a new position and being in an environment that was already tense because of some other things happening can really be challenging for anyone. And so because of my own experience, I can certainly understand the significance of making sure we are assigning the right tasks to our employees. And then the third one is the amount of work that we give to our teams at a time. Now, we move in a very fast-paced world, right? And so the demands that we put on our teams is largely based on our customers or the people that we are serving. And so we may not always have the flexibility or option to delay certain tasks. However, being mindful of the amount of tasks that is being handed to a person all at once can definitely go a long way. For example, let's say there is a situation where you have one employee who does something really, really well, and you have a new project that you want them to work on, but they already have 12 other projects. Would it really be helpful for them to add a 13th project? No, that's going to stress them out. And so in that case, it's important for us to understand whom else we can maybe call on to do that project so that we don't add more pressure to someone who already has a lot of pressure on them. Make sense? And so Hallowell puts so much emphasis on the work conditions because you have to be able to address that before you can even get to a point where the employee can shine. And we've talked about this in various ways throughout this season. So the fact that environment is important or that the work conditions is important should not be a surprise, right? And Hallowell does provide some examples on how to create a better work environment or how to create better work conditions. And some of the examples that he provides are connecting with our teams, genuinely making them feel smarter, healthier, more productive, assigning more tasks that they're good at. And that's not to suggest that there are tasks that they should skip out on. If anything, there needs to be somewhat of a balance, but just making sure that there isn't a pile on of things that we already know that they would not do well. So really being mindful of that. Because guess what? Even if it's something that we really want them to do well, giving them that repetitive task isn't going to help them unless we actually give them the tools, unless we actually teach them or demonstrate to them what it is that we're asking for. And so if you have this idea that, well, if they do it enough times, they'll get good at it. If you want to waste your time and their time, sure, you can take that approach. However, we're aiming for efficiency. We're aiming for peak performance. And so if we want them to do better, we actually have to be more hands-on with them to be better. And we'll touch on that a little bit more when we talk about the 5 steps. Also, encouraging them to have more of a work-life balance, encouraging them to take breaks and spend some time away from their computers throughout the day. Now, obviously, we don't want them to slack off and just hang out by the water cooler, right? But if you notice an employee is constantly at their desk, maybe ask, hey, did you have lunch today? If not, go ahead and get some lunch. Take a break. Something like that, just so that they feel that you care, which ultimately leads to their sense of belonging. And here's the thing, when we do those little things, we are actually creating a spark within them that makes them want to do well, that makes them want to be successful at their job. And that's one of the things that Hallowell learned about when he did this research on the brain. There's actually this switch, this thing that makes us want to do well, that sort of triggers us to achieve excellence. And the trigger comes from what I said previously about peak performance, putting the right people in the right place, in the right job, with the right conditions, and the right fit. And so this leads to what Hallowell describes as the cycle of excellence, the 5-step process for managing high performance. And so here are the 5 steps in the cycle of excellence. The first one is select, followed by connect. The third one is play. The fourth one is grapple and grow. And the fifth one is shine. And so let's talk about each of those and how it all connects to the performance appraisal process. So step 1, select, refers to selecting the right job or the right task for our employees. And there are a couple of things that we should keep in mind when making that selection. So 1, making sure it's something that they're good at. 2, making sure it's something that they actually like to do. And 3, making sure that it actually adds value to the team or to the organization. And so when you consider those 3, it's sort of like everybody wins, right? Because the employee gets to do things that they enjoy doing and that they're actually good at, but then us as the leader or manager gets to benefit from them doing their best with that specific task. Now, this is all assuming that you actually know what they enjoy doing and what they're good at, right? That's something that should take place very early on in the relationship that you're building with that employee. You may have a sense for that during the interview process, right? But you really won't know until you assign them things and start to assess their performance on those particular tasks. Once you sort of set that up, then it gives you a better idea of what it is that they actually do well. And there tends to be a correlation between what they do well and what they enjoy doing. Not always, but there tends to be. And so that's something that you can assess over time. And then once you get to the performance appraisal process, that's something that you can focus on going forward, or just using it as an opportunity to highlight the thing that they do well, right? Because as I shared previously, giving them that praise does help increase their productivity. So if they know that you recognize that they're doing the task well, that will make them want to do the task well more often. Okay, so after step 1 with selection, the next step is to connect with our teams, connect with our employees. And this is something that should be done genuinely, right? Going back to previous episodes, I talked about having good emotional intelligence. I talked about building interpersonal credibility. These are concepts that applies to what Hallowell has identified as connect. Doing things like having a positive attitude, inspiring them to do the same, establishing a work environment that feels authentic. And when you do these things, it actually boosts productivity. And one of the things that Hallowell learned is that when you create an environment that's based in fear, it actually disables people. It makes them do less work, even though they may not necessarily want to do less work. Just that pressure can distract them from the real task at hand, right? And this is actually something that came up in my own research. And when I think back to some of the interviews I did, some of the conditions that my participants described were just horrific. And I could see why they didn't do well in that environment. I could also see why they were very eager to leave that environment, because they either had a supervisor who was verbally abusive or unsupportive, or they had colleagues who were disrespectful. Things like that just are not conducive to a healthy work environment. And so as the leader or manager, it's important for us to make sure that we connect with our employees as well as with our teams as a whole, so that we get a sense for what is happening. And so if we don't have that sense of connection, we may not know that there are certain dynamics that are preventing our team members from doing their job well, right? And I talked about this a little bit in episode number 4. And Hallowell discovered when they have that sense of connection, it actually increases their flow within the work environment. And I feel like flow is a pretty hot topic right now. Like, a lot of people talk about being in the flow, which is essentially being in this state of mind where they can just get a lot of things done. And it doesn't feel like any time has passed. Like, they're just so focused. They're in almost like a trance state as they're doing the work. And that can't happen if there aren't the right conditions, right? So doing what we can to genuinely connect with our teams is crucial for achieving peak performance. Now that takes us to step 3, play. Now, when he says play, he doesn't necessarily mean break out the board games. He's referring to playing with creativity. Creativity is another hot topic right now in a lot of industries. And we're finding that when we specifically create spaces that support creativity, that also boosts performance. And so one of the things that Hallowell says in his book is that play constitutes the most advanced productive activity the human brain can engage in. And so doing things like creative problem solving and creating certain spaces that encourage play. Like I think about Google and how their office is set up and how when they did so, like it seemed to be a hoopla around it, right? Because it was something that had never been done before. But what they had learned is that by creating these workspaces and having all of these comfortable pieces of furniture, creating a relaxed setting that actually boosts creativity, that actually increases one's ability to play with certain concepts and ideas, right? And now a lot of tech companies are doing the same, where they're creating these more playful environments, right? And one story that comes to mind for me is when I did some remodeling in one of my office spaces. So aesthetics is important to me. I think I mentioned in a previous episode that I feel like I was an interior designer in a previous life because I put so much emphasis on how things look, and not so much for it to look perfect, but making sure that it feels inviting and comfortable. And one of the things that I recognized when I first started working at my alma mater was our office space was not inviting at all. We had this weird half wall and it felt very compartmentalized, and it sort of felt like we were an ordering counter. Like they would come up to this half wall and get what they needed, and it just didn't feel comfortable to me. And so one of the things that I did when I first started this job, luckily it was in the summertime, and so there weren't a lot of students around. I was able to work with our facilities team to remove that half wall, which completely transformed the space. Like students would actually come and sit in our office, like our student staff would come and hang out and do their homework. And so removing that half wall and decluttering the office, because that was also an issue, really helped to create a much more inviting environment. And so by opening up the space and putting up some inspirational posters and quotes, we really had a space where we could think. I forget where I read this, but a lot of people don't realize that clutter can really clutter our mind, like physical clutter. If you have a lot of papers or just a lot of things sort of in your view, that can impact your productivity. The more clean and concise your environment is, the more your mind will feel free to do some more of that creative thinking. Because think about it, if you are in a cluttered office space, your mind isn't thinking about the work that you're doing, right? It's thinking about the stack of papers over here, the empty cups over there, and then stack of books that are out of order over there. And so it just becomes a huge distraction. When we opened up that space, I really felt like that shifted our entire dynamic as a team, but it also shifted our dynamic and interactions with our students in a meaningful way. Now, I recognize that everyone may not have that luxury to be able to reorganize their office, right? And one of the things that I talked about previously in episode number 9, for example, I talked about hosting retreats, and I shared the story of how my team and I had a particular project that we were working on. And so I set it up so that we could go to a separate location that was out in the woods in a very open, giant lodge. And we did some creative thinking in terms of the development of this program. And I feel like that was necessary, especially given how complex this program was that we were creating. If there are limitations around your physical space in your office or office area, perhaps consider going somewhere else. And the justification for it is that you're trying to produce more play. You're trying to open your teams up to do some creative problem solving. And the current space that you're in may not be conducive for said activities, right? Now, if you're still not quite sold on this idea of play, there are 2 additional books that I would highly recommend. The first one being Change by Design: How Design Thinking Transforms Organizations and Inspires Innovation by Tim Brown. And the other one is The 10 Faces of Innovation by Tom Kelly. I feel like both of these books talk about creativity and innovation in a way that sort of brings that concept of play full circle. So again, if you're looking for some more literature around the importance of play, I highly recommend these 2 books, and I will include links to these books on my website. Okay, so at this point, we have covered connect, select, and play. The next step is grapple and grow, which is probably my favorite step, but it is also one of the trickiest steps because you're sort of in this teetering back and forth of, as it states, grappling and growing. So what Hallowell refers to grappling is sort of the development, that tough space where grit and hard work start to come into play. And the idea is for us as the supervisors to really push our teams, our staff members into that place of grappling, but also providing them with the tools to help them grow. And so ideally in this step, we're looking at the work that they're doing as well as the progress that they're making. So we're not solely basing things on the quantity in terms of how much work they're doing. It's also looking at the quality in terms of whether or not they're doing it well, and using it as an opportunity to assess whether or not there are some other effective ways for them to do said work. So if we go back to our conversations about motivation, and even Hallowell talks about this in his book, for the most part, our employees want to do well. They want to feel a sense of accomplishment, and that's great. And it's our job to sort of ignite that spark. One of the ways to do so is to challenge them. And as we're watching our teams and our staff members go through their process of doing these different projects, seeing where we could offer some advice, some techniques, some strategies that will help them perform those tasks in a much more efficient way. Sort of the difference between working smarter versus working harder. But again, these tasks should be challenging for them so that once they complete them, they feel that sense of accomplishment. For example, let's say you tap one of your team members to be the lead on a project, and this person has never played the leadership role before, but you sense that they have the potential, right? And so you ask them to lead this project, and you watch them and see how they handle it and have intentional interactions with them, offer them advice on how to do the project without doing it for them, as well as without sounding like they're not doing the job, right? This is the part where I say it's a little bit tricky. It's like you want to give them the advice, you want to give them some answers, but you also don't want them to feel like they have to do it your way. And so it's like you have to suggest something and then stand back and give them some breathing room to process it. If you are the type who likes to micromanage, this may not be the best strategy for you to use, because the idea is for them to take that ownership and control. And if you are looking for things to be done a very specific way, that sort of defeats the purpose of them taking the lead on a project. It's more of you just supervising them, right? You don't want it to be a situation where you say this person is the lead, but everyone else within the team knows that you're really the one pulling the strings, right? Well, I talked about this in a previous episode where I would give my employees the lead on a particular project and I would take the step back and simply be a team member. I would also be assigned tasks to do as it related to that particular project. And then during our one-on-one sessions, I would use that as an opportunity to check in with them and offer advice. And I found that approach worked for the most part. I will admit it does depend largely on how receptive they are to said suggestions, right? And so it's a very delicate dance that we sort of have to do of grapple and grow. Now, another area where things can get tricky is when you are providing your team members with feedback. So in terms of grapple and grow, I have one particular story that comes to mind. And it was a situation where I had a new staff member who did decent work, like there's no dispute there, but I could really see the potential in them to really expand themselves. And so I would provide them with opportunities to do that, to stretch them. And there were moments when it was frustrating for them, obviously, because they're being challenged, right? But I would always try to provide them with some kind of tool or resource to help them. And one of the things that I learned during the performance appraisal process is that this particular employee was used to always receiving high praise on their performance appraisal. So imagine a performance appraisal where you have 4 categories or 5 categories, exceeds expectations is on one end, and then not meeting expectations or unsatisfactory at the other end, right? And this person was used to getting exceeds expectations. Now, given that they were new, I didn't quite feel like they were at that level yet. However, they were doing well, and so I gave them a rating somewhere in the middle. And that was a first for them. Like, they were really surprised that they got this score on their performance appraisal. And so one of the things to be mindful of is that when we do performance appraisals, if we inflate them in any way, that makes it really challenging to get our employees to grow. And so that created a little bit of friction for us, right? Because at the end of the day, I didn't necessarily want my employee to not feel appreciated, because I did appreciate them. But I also saw the potential for them to do more. And so that's where the grapple and grow process became that much more important, because I didn't want them to feel like I was not satisfied with their work or that I was disappointed in them, because that was certainly not the case. But understanding that it was going to be a process that we worked through, right? If you're doing really well, I'm going to make sure you know that you're doing really well. If you have some things that you need to work on, I'm going to make sure I tell you you have these things to work on. However, that's not how they interpreted it because of the rating. And so when we did the performance appraisal the following year, I felt like the higher rating was much more deserving because they went through that process of grapple and grow. And I feel that over time, they also realized that they had grown. And so I feel like by getting a lower rating the first year, this employee was much more motivated to really expand themselves and challenge themselves. And they did tremendously. Like, I could literally see the growth, even in just how they carried themselves in meetings and how they led certain projects. I could see that transformation. And that was ultimately what I was going for, right? Thankfully, we were able to work through it. And I feel like they felt much more empowered by the end of that process. Now, in terms of how long this process takes, really depends on you and just how your office functions. For me, it was really a 2-year process for this particular person, because I needed some time to understand their work process so that I could determine where are there opportunities for efficiencies, where are there opportunities for them to expand themselves, where are there opportunities for them to challenge themselves, and so on. You know, it was a learning process for me as well in terms of being transparent about what I was trying to do in terms of their growth and development. Again, grapple and grow, one of my favorite steps. But, you know, it was a learning process for me as well in terms of being transparent about what I was trying to do in terms of their growth and development. Again, grapple and grow, one of my favorite steps. But, you know, it was a learning process for me as well in terms of being transparent about what I was trying to do in terms of their growth and development. Again, grapple and grow, one of my favorite steps. it can certainly have its challenges. And so I feel like that is really important to know going into this. And then the last step number 5, is shine. And shine is what happens when that person realizes their growth, and we as their supervisors acknowledge that growth as well. And that acknowledgement piece is really what shine is about. You're praising them for their growth. And so that's why monitoring their progress is so important, because sometimes when we're in it, we don't necessarily see the transformation, right? And so for them going through the transformation, they may not necessarily recognize that a transformation was taking place. But us as the supervisors looking from the outside can tell the story of that transformation from a different level. In the book, Hallowell provides several different examples of how to promote shine. They include recognize one's efforts, not just the results that they produce, monitoring that progress and letting them know, like, I saw where you were and I see where you are now and you're on the right track. Notice the small details in terms of what changes were made, providing some recognition to that person in person. And having that public praise really goes a long way. Anything that you can do to provide them with that praise in person, but also with other people around, can really make that person shine. So when it comes to shine, there's one story in particular that comes to mind. And it was a year where I actually did a workshop on this very topic with some staff members that I indirectly supervised. And it was a new concept for them. And they really took to this topic, which was really cool because I wasn't quite sure how they would interpret it, but they were very drawn to it, to the point where they actually did their own research. And they found this infographic for me to include in my training that talked about how to make introverts shine and how to make extroverts shine, which was really cool because I hadn't considered that, one, and two, it provided me with a resource that I could, again, use in future trainings. However, it wasn't until the end of that year when I realized the impact that this workshop had on them. I feel like the morale within their teams was much higher. I feel like they really enjoyed what they were doing as supervisors, using this tool to supervise their teams, and really taking to this idea of making their staff members shine, like really making that their priority as the supervisor. And I felt like that was really cool because it was something that I was passionate about, and I was able to get other people passionate about it as well. And so as I wrap up this episode, I hope that I at least gave you a glimpse into this cycle of excellence and how it all is interconnected in terms of how we can build morale, how we can motivate our teams to really do well and want to do well. And so overall, I highly recommend checking out Hallowell's book, which I will include a link on my website for you to check out. And as you can see throughout this episode, there were many things that we had talked about in previous episodes, and this sort of brought everything together, right? And so when it comes to our employees, we are in the best positions to really push them to a point where they want to shine. And so that's what I want you to walk away with today, all right? And so with that said, let's go ahead and start with this episode's gratitude list. First, I'm grateful for my grad school professor, Tom, who introduced me to this book that I absolutely enjoyed reading. Full disclosure, I didn't like reading a lot of books just in general. However, once I got to grad school, suddenly I enjoyed reading, and I think it was because of the content, right? And so I'm very grateful for Tom introducing me to this book because it's something that I continue to revisit over and over again as it relates to my own style for really building up my employees. So thank you, Tom. Second, I'm grateful for the members of my team who were receptive to this concept of shine and the cycle of excellence. As I mentioned previously, when I did the training with one set of staff members, the fact that they really took to the topic and did their own research and found ways to incorporate it in their own style really meant a lot to me. And so I'm very appreciative of that aspect of it, but also for those with whom I employed this cycle with and who had to work with me in terms of that grapple and grow process and how they came out on the other side grateful for the entire experience, right? And so ideally in season 2, you'll get to hear from some of those folks about their experience. And then last, but certainly not least, I'm grateful for my Uncle Keith, who was a huge supporter of my podcast. And in fact, one of the things that he did before his passing was share my podcast on his Facebook. And I thought that was really cool. So thank you, Uncle Keith. Okay, so the affirmation for this episode is, my intention as a leader is to help my employees shine at work. And that's ultimately what we should be aiming towards, right? We want our teams to shine. We want them to do well. We want them to feel a sense of connection and belonging and self-actualization as it relates to the work that they're doing with us. So it's important for us to do our part to make sure that they shine. All right, so that wraps up this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it, and you can look forward to episode number 11, where we will talk about change leadership, and that's going to be a fun topic. Okay, so thank you so much for listening, and have a great day. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me. Before you go, please make sure that you like and subscribe down below. Also, I included a few recommended videos for you to check out. Thank me later.